for staying. Hi, everybody. So as I said, we really view these post-show conversations as a chance for us to collectively reflect on the performance, and even though we are going to share a little bit about sort of our thoughts, this is really a chance for you to ask questions, for us to respond to each other's thoughts in this room. Because Quintessence, our mission is to bring classical works of literature and theater to life for contemporary audiences, we really, really want to just have this opportunity to have a discussion about all of the interesting nuances of this complex and really stunning piece of theater. Before I get started, I do want to introduce our two guest speakers from Ursinus College. Meghan Brodie is an associate professor of theater and the chair of the Department of Theater and Dance at Ursinus College. She teaches dramatic literature, theater history, and dramaturgy. Meghan has previously written about queer casting and feminist directing, co-edited 2 anthologies of performance pieces written by LGBTQ youth and allies, and partnered with the Remember the Women Institute on several projects about women in theater and the Holocaust. For more information, you can visit meghanbrodie.com. And Kate Isabel Foley is a senior theater and English honors student at Ursinus College. Kate's playwriting credits include Pride and Prejudice at Pemberley College, a contemporary queer adaptation of Jane Austen's much-loved classic, and Captain Darling, a dark reimagining of Peter Pan in which Mrs. Darling takes center stage and must decide how far she will go to save her children from a surprising foe. Kate was the dramaturg for Ursinus's productions of Angela Carter's radio plays Puss in Boots and The Company of Wolves. Recent performances include roles in Pride and Prejudice, The Oldest Profession, and Execution of Justice. She will next appear as Joan in Small Mouth Sounds at Ursinus. Please give them a round of applause for joining us. So I'm just going to start just to talk a little bit about the 1934 taxi strike. I think it's really, really interesting to think about the impetus for this piece really coming from that moment in history that Odets was then using as a way to think about all of the different vignettes and the flashbacks that are created in the scene. There's some really, really great articles that you can find online, some in the New York Times that document the strike, as well as I found a couple in The Militant, which was the Socialist Workers' Party newspaper at the time. And there's some just really interesting information out there. The Supreme Court had declared, the Supreme Court of New York had declared the 5-cent tax that they're being charged for every fare illegal. And so even though Mayor LaGuardia had gotten elected denouncing that nickel fare, it was very, very quickly that the taxi drivers union went into strike in February of 1934. There were 500 men reported to be part of the demonstration. And it was because of the miserable conditions, right? In the play, we sort of hear like $5 a week, $6 a week. The New York Times reported $10 a week was sort of the maximum. And that was with people working 12-hour shifts. Some drivers were working 24 hours and sort of just being asleep in their cab whenever they couldn't find a fare. As the strike was happening, right, people broke into cab windows, they ripped off taxi doors, they would pull the drivers from the cabs and stop passengers from getting in. And even as the police tried to stop the strike, it was organized, and the drivers sort of broke up into smaller groups and sort of spread out through all Manhattan. It was continued until 1 or 2 a.m. in the morning that day in February. And even though that striking was not a new thing for unions at the time, right? It was reported as one of the more violent strikes. And so that's just something to note as we really sort of continue to have that conversation about, when words and conversations seem no long enough for some people and they feel compelled to take that step to action, right? What does that mean in terms of that? And then, as I sort of wrap up, and again, there's so much more information about the strike that you can look up and research. I'm always struck by the Gerald Wheels biography of Clifford Odets, and this point sort of really resonated with me. He says, Waiting for Lefty says a great deal less about the actual taxi strike of 1934 than it does by implication about the general labor situation of the time, right? So what does that mean? Where Odets is not trying to sort of authentically replicate what was going on, right? We sort of don't hear about the strike, we hear about the impulse for it, but is much more interested in, the working class and exploring what those characters are like, and really thinking about the challenges of labor, which are still ongoing to this day.
So I just wanted to share a little bit about Clifford Odets, the playwright.
Can you speak louder, please?
Sure. As a writer myself, I'm always interested in the people behind the works that we see on stage. And Clifford Odets is a fascinating writer and person. There's so much I could share, and I'll boil it down to just a few basics, but if anyone's interested in more, I have much more I could share. Clifford Odets was born in Philadelphia in 1906. He dropped out of high school at a young age to become a poet, then switched to acting on the radio. He didn't make a lot of money, but he gained a lot of experience, took on a lot of odd jobs. In 1927, he played 32 different roles on stage in a single season. And he even appeared as an actor in Waiting for Lefty during one of the productions. I like this description from a New York Times obituary that described him. As a tall, shy man with piercing eyes, a curt manner of speaking, and hair that stood up as if tinged with electricity, he moved unobtrusively around Hollywood social circles, frequently with an attractive girl on his arm, talking, as one of his friends described it, like a character in one of his plays. He definitely had a strong personality and extremely strong opinions of his own work that didn't often match up with critics. Critics and audiences would praise his works, but if he wasn't happy with it, he would say, no, that wasn't one of my strongest, and vice versa. And as an artist, he dabbled in not only playwriting, but also screenwriting in Hollywood and directing. Some were massive successes, some were failures. He had a very tumultuous career. He was not a straight success, but Waiting for Lefty was one of his more successful pieces. And he produced a few other works. Awake and Sing was another one act that was often paired with Waiting for Lefty for a complete 2-hour production. When he didn't have a lot of success with the following stage plays, he moved to Hollywood to establish his career as a screenwriter. Those were flops, so then he shifted to directing. But after that, he only had one success. He moved back to the stage. He bounced back and forth between New York and California. And a lot of his artist friends would criticize him for being a sellout to Hollywood, for leaving the stage in New York. So there was a lot of conflict there. And then his death was also very fascinating, very graphic. I'll spare you some of the more gruesome details. But after 3.5 years of experiencing gastric distress, he was found to have stomach cancer, and after that diagnosis, he rapidly declined. But when he knew that he didn't have much time left, he wanted to dedicate what little time he had to writing. He spent 14 to 16 hours a day writing, even as he was extremely ill. He would write from his hospital bed. He wrote television scripts. He was drafting plays. He was planning a musical production, all of these projects that were left unfinished after he died. But towards the end, he started to lose some of his faculties. His mental state was declining. He attempted to propose to his psychoanalyst. He wanted to reconnect with his estranged father. He was convinced that the nurses were trying to poison him, so they ended up having to give him larger doses of sedatives to restrain him. And even after all of the prolific pieces that he produced, he wrote in his diary soon before his death that he felt that he'd wasted most of his life. He produced so many works, but still felt that there was more to do. So he was someone who was unfinished and still wanted to write even towards the end.
How old was
He was 57 when he died.
Was he
involved in the blackballing of presumed communists in the 50s?
Yes, so he actually was a part of the Communist Party, but left after less than a year. of affiliation because he felt that they were interfering with the censorship of his work and didn't want to be restricted by that. So.
The anti-communist movement, the blackballing of artists.
Yes, he did appear before the committee and testified after being questioned about his affiliation with the Communist Party.
Yeah, and I think I was reading the other day that one of the things that he said when they asked him about Waiting for Lefty in specific is he was like, oh no, it wasn't inspired by the strike, right? So there's also, I mean, there's a lot of that was going on too, where like people weren't feeling comfortable coming forward and saying, yes, I identify, or at least I understand what's going on with the party and feeling they had to be dishonest.
And what happened is when he testified, that also ruined his career because he was a rat.
Yes.
And we will open it up for questions and comments just in a moment. But Meghan Brodie is going to talk a little bit just about political theater in general, so we can add that and layer that into our conversation as well.
Yes, so I love political theater, but I think one of the most difficult things is what is political theater? We tend to default to, oh, well, it'll be like a Republican and a Democrat. There'll be some perspective. And I tend to think of political theater more broadly, right? I think of it as theater that sort of pokes you and asks you to think about where you stand and what you're going to do about it. What you're going to do about that particular issue. And so one of the things that I love about Waiting for Lefty is it's emerging from the 1930s in the United States, and we see political theater sort of across genres, playwrights really emerging. And what's interesting is we tend to think of Waiting for Lefty and this type of drama as something we associate with the Works Progress administration. It's coming just after this. And in fact, I think Clifford Odets would have been sort of the ideal playwright or working for the Federal Theater Project, when suddenly you have folks dramatizing the headlines, finding ways of making the Depression and the workers' play accessible to new audiences, so that it really was towing a line because it was federally funded. Wow, 4 years of federally funded theater, and then it stopped, unsurprising. But was asking American citizens to think about what was happening across the United States and how a farmer's sort of economic circumstances in the Midwest would affect a shopkeeper's circumstances on the East Coast. And in finding ways of dramatizing this, quite often like Waiting for Lefty, in very short vignettes, you could expose an audience to a variety of perspectives and show how they were all interrelated. And so really, Waiting for Lefty is way ahead of its time. Bertolt Brecht is working on epic theater at this same time. And then when we think contemporarily about folks like Anna Devere Smith, right? Who is telling stories and asking actors to inhabit other people's stories. We can think about Execution of Justice by Emily Mann, who's looking at docudrama. So we have a lot of forms that are sort of subgenres of political theater, but I think Waiting for Lefty anticipates so many of those in such smart ways. And we can trace a lot of the roots of the contemporary forms back to the 1930s. We just don't tend to look there. So I'm so excited when folks like Quintessence are going back into the archive and showing us that, sadly, Waiting for Lefty is just as relevant for us today and is asking us some of the same questions, and again asking us, what is it that we're going to do about it? I mean, for me, the moment also when the doctor says, you know, doctors don't control medicine in the United States, and I'm like, yeah, tell me about it, and what are we going to do about it? But I'm super excited, and I would love to know what your questions are for all of us, or your thoughts, or what did this make you feel? Absolutely, go ahead.
Okay, so it made me feel
feel that the class angle is very clearly represented. But then, at least in Philadelphia, there's a racial angle with the unions. And what came to mind immediately was the PTC, the Philadelphia Transit Strike of 1944, when the company hired the first 8 black trolley drivers and 4,500 white workers struck in the midst of the war. So preserving their position, their racial privilege, was more important than winning the war because it brought war production to a stop. So that, and also at times, more recently, unions have prevented black people from joining so that they had no opportunity to advance. So that angle, I didn't find that angle portrayed.
No, I'm so glad that you say that, and I think that we don't see it in Waiting for Lefty in exactly the same way, but in seeing how folks are excluded because of race and because of faith, you get this idea that sometimes behind the scenes, you frequently have white people saying, okay, if you let this group in, it's less pie for you, as opposed to saying, why don't we get more pie, right? That it's so that you find a way, and I think it's of forcing different folks to turn on each other, right? As opposed to turning on the folks at the top who are still raking in the profits, right? And so in that case, it's okay. So we have moved forward. We see a greater diversity of workers. And instead, the thought is, I will have less. And I think that notion of I will have less is coming from the top, right? That if we expand, then there may be fewer benefits for you, when in reality, it's often greater profits. And so I'm so happy that you mentioned that. And we see someone who makes a stand, who says, I will not betray my conscience and spy on this person for you. But the stakes are also so high, right? She loses her job. And that risk in stepping forward, I think, becomes more apparent. But you're right, more contemporarily, we see groups sometimes within the same organizations divided along a lot of different identity lines, because they bought into this false narrative that if there's more for someone else, there's less for you. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Yes.
I think political theater is powerful, but I think that maybe sometimes, I think that there was something else in the play. There was more a commentary on the human condition.
What?
Rather than the time, the politics, it was a more equalizing, saying we're all humans, this is who we are, regardless of who we are.
Yeah, and for me, that sort of goes back to this notion of Clifford Odets becomes a playwright because he was an actor, right? And so what that means is, even though, as opposed to a piece of, in theater history circles, we call it agitprop, right? Agitation propaganda, which is sort of that much more seemingly polemic, here's an ideology and the point is more important than the people, right? Odets is always starting from what the characters are saying, what the characters are feeling. And again, I'm curious if that sort of changes the way that the play, the way that he would have constructed the piece.
Yeah, we don't stay at the meeting, we go into these tiny vignettes to see how it affects the everyday person.
So forgive me if I'm being redundant, I'm having a little trouble hearing in whatever direction. But in response to what this lovely woman back here said, it seems to me that it could be that the reason that you did not see that issue portrayed is, when was this written? Odets was writing, I'm sorry?
Yeah, 35, 34,
35, and
yeah.
it probably wasn't even on his radar screen. He was white, right?
Yes.
And the taxi cab drivers were white, and I think it's a function of what was already, well, for hundreds of years, instilled in our American culture is the exclusion, the blinders on for white people, that we didn't even see the black experience, and it didn't cross his mind because there weren't any black cab drivers at the time. And it would be great if there could be something like this that included that, or was about that, but certainly that included it.
Yeah, black people weren't on the radar screen. So we suffered at another level. And it wasn't until much later, I guess, in the 60s.
Can you speak louder?
There are black people. Well, let's look at their experience, and that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, she said that black people weren't on folks' radar, and it's not really until we move into the 50s and 60s that sort of becomes a part of public consciousness. I think the closest thing you might see here is, right, the exclusion of the doctor because he is Jewish, and because everyone knows that he is Jewish, and part of that is his name recognition, but yeah, we see it in just sort of a couple other groups, but nowhere near as explicitly.
But you have the lady at the factory or the business that's creating the
Yes.
poison gas
Yeah.
use the N-word.
Yes.
And another derogatory,
Yeah.
she references. And you have that character who, you have the whole negation of people of color through the Asian prism. Because,
Yes.
they're creating this gas which we think later will be used,
Yeah.
for-
And they were willing to sacrifice her.
Right.
Yes.
And the people, and that whole, So,
Well, and the fear of you have to stay here, right? You have to live here, you can't leave, and then it raises the question of, does she ever get to leave?
Right.
Right? Or is it sort of a deal with the devil? I think I said.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wondered if Quintessence deliberately did a vignette with the taxi driver who's a BIPOC, a man of color, and the brother hates him and doesn't want him to be involved with his sister. I mean, I know probably Clifford Odets was writing that because that was a taxi driver and he had no future, but Quintessence cast that person as a BIPOC, and I just wondered if you were bringing in the racism.
So the director for this production is a black director. His name's Kyle Hayden. And so as he was working with the actors, those conversations about who to cast in what role, to have resonances with contemporary discourses about race, was part of the ongoing conversation.
Just like the woman who has a wife. What? That would not have happened in the 1930s. I have trouble having a wife today.
But it is sort of an interesting phenomenon, right? In terms of like, and that's why I love having these conversations, because it allows us to reflect on like how the text can change, how the text can have new meanings, as well as sometimes when the text is limited, right? And how we have to have ongoing conversations about the things that are going on in the text.
So what kind of liberties do you take with a play like that?
Oh, I'm sorry, can
What
you?
kind of liberties do you take with a play like that? Just to...
Oh, what kind of liberties? No, I mean, I think that's a really, really good question, right? If you think about, so what kind of liberties do you take when a text doesn't seem to be speaking and resonating enough, right? I think a great comparison is the liberties that many companies take with Shakespeare, right? Now, one, that's in the public domain, right? So there isn't any repercussions in terms of adding language, changing character identities, sort of all of those things are just a general perspective, right? A lot of my research is on Tennessee Williams, and it's so fascinating to me how estates of a lot of the playwrights in the United States, right, are still trying to hold on to this reflection of the society in which they were writing. And, that can only go away in 50 years, when they will also be in the public domain and someone can do whatever they want with it. So again, it is like the liberties question is fascinating to me.
Yeah, do you want to, about casting?
Yes, I was
Yeah,
gonna-
absolutely, go for it.
I think we're seeing that with casting a lot too, both on Broadway and off. If we think about the recent production of 1776, that was all cast with women and non-binary actors, or even Six, the musical, which takes, pretty white history of Henry VIII and places people of color, women, gender nonconforming actors at the center. There are a lot of ways to take these very white, cisgender, heteronormative stories and allow other people to tell them in order to tell their own stories at the same time. And that's something we talked a lot about at Ursinus too, with color-conscious casting rather than colorblind casting, figuring out what sort of implications might be made if certain people are in certain roles. But it's a really nuanced conversation, and it is difficult when something isn't in the public domain, if the rights have certain stipulations that they want, so you have to do as much as you can within those limitations.
And it's fascinating how the theater community is still very much responding to these calls for actions, right? Like there isn't a general acceptance, right? And it's been like at least 10 years? I don't know, that sort of these, like these detailed activist-driven.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's still like.
Full steam ahead, right, yes,
Trying to figure out, yeah, go ahead.
I'm just dying to ask you, if you're talking about the historical setting and then the modern additions, who chose the music?
We have an amazing sound designer.
How does the music fit into the thought process of what it's doing to us?
No, I think that's an amazing question. I don't personally have the answer to that. I'd love to hear if people have responses, like what the responses to the music was.
You mentioned that the director was black,
Yes.
even though the text wasn't extended to include our experience, the music had text in it, and it spoke to our experience.
Yeah.
So I'd like to see the text extended to match the music.
Could you repeat that within your?
Yeah, I didn't hear a word she said.
She got it.
You mentioned that the director was black.
Yeah,
And-
sound
yeah, and you-
version
right,
is
and you
true.
mentioned that the text wasn't extended, however, all of the music, all of the soundtrack was black.
Right,
And the lyrics spoke to the black experience.
right.
So I would like to see the actual text in the play catch up with the music in the background. So I guess that's as far as the director could take it. He was black, and he put the
And
black.
the sound
music
person was too.
to the sound
Well,
person.
you can't change the text.
No.
The text is the script.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, one of the things I saw a human experience,
Yes.
not necessarily that it excluded anything, You got it for the times, but when you talked about the color blindness thing, when Bridgerton first came out, I thought that was a perfect example of characters and not color. Like, I didn't see the people in there by their color, I saw them by their character. Now, I know during that time period, there were people of color there, but it was very interesting, and so was Hamilton.
Yes.
Kind of where you put people into positions not because of how they look, but because of the character that they play. And we can see they are moving in that direction, that not all characters are based on what you look like.
Right, and why are we bound by what is historically accurate? Isn't there some power in imagining something different?
Because we're human.
Yeah,
That's
yes.
why, and we've always been all together anyway. We can't get rid of each other.
Thank you. I know, and that's just the way it works.
Oh, yes.
I was really impressed with how the whole play pulled together, how insidious and inhuman the entire system is that we're living with. Whether it was the corrupt union official saying, listen to the president because he's going to help you so much, and all the way down that you become a doctor and a whole family, and you're still caught, to the laboratory worker who must have had some level of education, and her boss that she couldn't change, and even the taxi drivers then all the way down, or even the taxi driver's sister what are you gonna do, what is the strike gonna get? It's like the entire system is so insidious and inhuman, there was nothing you could do. There was a real fatalism to the play that I think still exists to this day.
No, and to speak back to that point, the point that you raised so lovely, right, is it's like the individual on their own, right, will never be able to accomplish the change that is necessary.
Right.
Yes, in the back, yeah.
Can you talk about early political theater audiences? Were they the working class, the wealthy?
Dr. Brodie is very excited to answer that.
Yes, so it really ran the gamut. So Bertolt Brecht, German playwright theorist, he is writing what he calls epic theater, and he meant it to be performed in factories with the factory workers. He wanted to use theater as a tool for, as a political tool, really, to bring people together so that you weren't the individual, but also to acknowledge folks' problems where they were and to have them enact different solutions. Whereas the Federal Theater Project, at a time when you still had illiterate populations, were taking big headline news and dramatizing it in a way that was accessible to everyone and offering free tickets or offering low price tickets so that folks who would not traditionally be theater patrons have access to it in new ways. And so both of those are reimagining what we tend to think of as maybe a more affluent white audience and saying, no, we have to be much more purposeful in reaching non-traditional audiences, and by that they mean everyone, right? And so I think that you often, not always with political theater, you are keeping an eye on how do you bring together community and cast a broader net, and sometimes that means overcoming challenges to accessibility. It might be cost, but it also might be contemporarily ASL interpretation, or it might be the time of day, to really think about how can I make this open and inviting to everyone. And it's hard. It requires a lot of coordination, but it's so worth it because you're building a community and people can find each other. I love that every performance is different. No one will ever see the same performance of Waiting for Lefty that you saw today.
Amen to that.
Right? And so I feel like that's something that I share with all of you, and I so value that.
And the other really interesting thing is the first performance of Waiting for Lefty cost $8 to put on.
Maybe in 1935.
Right? So yeah, in 1935. But still, right? So to think about this potential of like writing for an audience where you're not paying for a big budget, you're not paying, enormous
Phantom of the
actor.
Opera.
You're not paying for the spectacle, right? You're not paying for, famous actors, right? You're paying for the story and the message, right? What does that mean for a playwright to be writing for that type of theater?
I want to go back to the music because the music classes for me just did not fit.
Yes, it did. It just didn't fit your culture.
Just
I was into it.
If you listen to the words, forget that it's black. The words fit.
Well, and I think there's something about this, again, we keep sort of circling back to this notion of how far we can stretch a text, right? What does it mean to sort of think about a variety of experiences who are responding to it, right? The music was very striking to me because it was thematically representing the things that were going on inside of the actors who were in this production, right?
Was the reference to the woman's wife, that in the original text?
Yeah.
No, it's not two women.
Well, I believe the character is originally a man in the text, so.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
I really enjoyed the lighting, especially that last image, when the image comes out of the.
Well, that's where designers can often take us, just like the sound designers, beyond the text, and suddenly it's relevant to us right now and it's immediate.
Yes.
One of the things when you talked about the people at the top should have a bigger pie. Right now, today, we hear some people talk about you're gonna be replaced, that's the chant, so
It's fear mongering within
Yeah,
groups
but-
because if you can divide them,
So,
they
yeah.
can't unite.
So that's 1935, this is 2023.
Yeah, well-
I mean, the conversation is like that.
Amazon, right? In trying to avoid unionization by scaring folks about what will happen if unionization happens, that they may be deprived of some things as opposed to acknowledging they don't have to be deprived of anything, that's a corporate decision. So it plays out quite similarly. And I have an Amazon account.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. We have some lovely productions that are coming up. We're doing William Shakespeare's The Tempest, and then we're doing an original premiere work about Phyllis Wheatley called Written by Phyllis. That's going to happen in May. We are continuing to have these post-show conversations the second Sunday of every run, and we also have, probably in about a week, I will be announcing our other opportunities to take classes and sort of join the conversation surrounding the production of that.
So at this
But,
theater.
yep, at this theater. But thank you so much for coming.